Hello all you lovely photographers and filmmakers out there. I welcome you all to the very first episode of the Filmy Monday. So guys, talking about Filmy Monday, let me give you a little bit context and background story of this. So recently I decided, as I learned from this YouTube community, so why not give back to it? Why not share all the lessons of filmmaking, photography and Lightroom editing that I have learned from YouTube and help you all people to grow as professional photographers, filmmakers and Lightroom editors, great artists. Okay guys, and then I came up with this schedule that on Mondays I'll be teaching filmmaking right from basics to professional things, and on Wednesdays we will be talking about some Lightroom tutorials in which I'll be teaching different aspects of Lightroom and then help you to find out your very own style so that you can go out in that professional world of Lightroom editing and present your very own style. And then coming to the third thing, on every Friday we will be having some lessons on photography. On the recent one I had a lesson on exposure triangle, and today on Monday I thought maybe I should discuss something similar like that in filmmaking. Okay guys, talking about filmmaking, I thought the only one thing that differs in the exposure triangle of stills and in the exposure triangle of motion picture is shutter speed. I mean, the application in filmmaking of shutter speed is really very different. I mean, when we talk about shutter speed in filmmaking, we take the consideration of motion blur, because shutter speed has all to do with the motion blur in filmmaking. So it is considered that we should take shutter speed complementary to the frame rates. Now talking about frame rates, what are frame rates, my dear friends? So frame rate can be defined as the speed at which, the rate at which your camera is recording frames, and it can be measured in the unit of frame per second. So talking about the frame per second, basically the conventional frame per second unit of film industry is 24 frames. However, it can go down up to 12 frames per second, and by that, up to that point, you can record something and it could be perceived as motion picture. While at the same time, my dear friends, I would say that it could change from time to time. So in this video, we will discuss how you can use shutter speed and frame rates to your very own benefit. So let's begin with it. Now talking about these things, let's begin with the very first thing about these two aspects, that is the 180-degree shutter rule. So basically, what is this 180-degree shutter rule? See guys, when we talk about 180-degree shutter rule, the rule is that your shutter speed should be the double of your frame rate. I mean, if your frame rate is 24 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be 1/50th of that. I mean, why this is considered as conventional, let's talk about that as well. Now see, when we go in cinema, the approach of a filmmaker is to bring as much realistic experience for a person who is watching that film as much it is possible. So when we see through our eyes, the motion blur which we get right now, I mean, I'm filming right now at the frame rate of 24 frames per second and my shutter speed is double of that. So the motion blur which you are getting right now is very much similar to the reality. But if you crank up the shutter speed a little bit, now as you can see, it is getting a little bit sharp and crisper. The motion blur is getting less. Now when we talked about that, so it was the basic conventional thing that people keep in their mind. Now moving a little bit ahead. Now see, basically filmmakers don't break this rule without any certain reason. There are certain reasons in filmmaking that they keep in their mind when they think that it is much more creative to break this rule, otherwise they don't break that rule at all. And let's talk about these out of the box thinking processes. So the very first one is, now if there is certain kind of scene in which your actor is under a dreamy state, or I mean, if your actor is in a dream and you have to show that it is blurred reality, during that time I would say that you can decrease your shutter speed to almost like 1/30th of a second or 1/25th of a second, because if you will do that, what will happen that there would be a lot of motion blur which wouldn't look as realistic, and at the same time it would look much more like a surreal experience or something which is bringing out some kind of subconscious thought or some dreamy look. So that is the first out of the conventional zone which people consider while they are making film. While at the same time, on the contrary, there's also this another rule when filmmakers crank up their shutter so high, and this happens mostly in action scenes. For example, the very first one, if there are much more action scenes like boxing scenes are being recorded during that time, what filmmakers consider that it is much better to crank our shutter speed in order to give those boxing punches much more crisper look, because at that time people want to experience those punches. They don't want any kind of motion blur just to stop them. They want to have that crisp focus on those punches. Or even if, let's take example from this Saving Captain Ryan, I think that was the movie, yeah. In that, when they open at this, when the ships open and there are so many blasts of machine guns, that scene was shot at a higher shutter speed, so in order to bring that, you know, sharp motion of those guns firing in the sea towards those soldiers. So these are few examples which you can keep in mind when you could go out of the conventional rule of 180-degree shutter rule. Now when it comes to frame rate, I would highly recommend that if you are recording a film, in order to give that cinematic look, you should record at 24 frames per second. Now why is that a case? Now see, the reality which we perceive is considered to be much more similar to that of 24 frames per second in a film, while at the same time if you crank it a little bit upwards towards 30 frames, while at the same time you won't be able to, with the naked eye, see much more difference. However, if the shutter speed goes much more higher, let's talk about 48 frames per second or 60 frames per second, which happens in some kind of fantasy movies or some video games, then you will be able to notice that kind of difference. But now talking about when to do those exceptions. Now first of all, you might have seen some movies like Hobbit in 3D, which has been filmed at 48 frames per second. Now why has been that case? See guys, I would say that Hobbit is a fantasy film with lot of action happening in it, with lot of surreal scenes, and at the same time those scenes required that kind of action. If you are filming a realistic scene, at that time if you would film in 24 frames per second, that is something which is very much beneficial for you. Okay guys, now let's talk about slow motion, and at the same time we would like to talk about time lapse, how to record those things, because they also require certain kind of mastery on frame rates and shutter speed. Okay, now talking about slow motion. Now in order to get a slow motion, what you need to do is you have to increase your frame rate while filming, and while at the same time keeping in mind 180-degree shutter rule, you have to increase your shutter speed as well. For example, if you are increasing your frame rate to 60 frames per second, then your shutter speed be 1/120th of a second. I hope you're getting what I'm trying to say, in order to maintain that 180 shutter rule. Now what happens is that when you have filmed it, now it isn't going to be in slow motion, only it is that a number of frames have been increased. Now in post processing, what you have to do is that you have to extend that in order to make it film in 24 frames timeline. I hope you're getting that, and we would be discussing the post processing in the upcoming classes later on. After that, when you are filming time lapse, the problem with a lot of filmmakers is that what they do is that they simply film a time lapse and then go into post processing and then compress it. Now it is alright, the only problem is that you are not going to get that motion blur, because that number of frames are just being compressed. However, I would recommend that if you are filming a time lapse on 24 frames per second, do one thing, that please decrease your shutter speed to 1/4 of a second. I mean, that's what I do sometimes, and you would get the required motion blur in your time lapse when you compress it in post-processing later on. So these were the basic things that you have to keep in your mind with respect to shutter speed and frame rate. I hope this helped. If it helped you, consider subscribing and hitting like to this video, and more class in tutorials will be coming very soon. I hope you enjoyed this one. I will see you in the Lightroom tutorial on Wednesday. Till then, enjoy yourself, have fun, and peace.